reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you.
So back in the day, when it came to these poor people, I guess, and when it came to working, a lot of these guys, usually when it came to, right, and when it came to, like, wealth, this actually, what they were given for their hard work was basically what was going to get them to their next meal, basically. Mm-hmm. And, like, majority of these guys, they had, like, a feast, like, once a year, like, max. And usually people had what they said was, like, one, like, good, like, robe or t-shirt that they wore, like, one. And, like, you see, like, that's why, like, throughout the Bible, when you see, it mentions a lot how they, like, because they were rich, they had multiple feasts. And it's because rich people were able to feast all the time. Poor people were never able to actually get, like, big feasts and everything. Mm-hmm. And so when you put it in that scenario, and you see this scenario that they say about how the rich people are holding back, and these guys are abundant in wealth, that means that they have more wealth than they actually need. And the fact that they're holding back from these poor people, like, it just makes it that much worse. Like, it just makes the scenario so much worse than what it is. And like, you see that the sins of the rich here are, like, really condemned by James. And, like, he is not happy, I guess, with, like we said, of how we're using our money and, like, the attitude behind it.
And something that stood out to me is that it says, the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. And I just thought that was something that really, that was significant, because it shows that amongst that suffering and amongst that injustice, God does care. And that he's not blind to the pain of his people, and that later on you'll see that he will do something about it, and that there will be justice for those who were downtrodden.
Yeah. What this verse reminds me of is it says, into the wages of the laborers, and they cried out when God heard their cries. That reminded me of the Israelites when they were in captive with the Egyptians, and they weren't treated justly in no way, but God yet still heard their cries. And I think that's something that I found really comforting, because there's a lot of awful things happening.
Injustices, basically.
Lots of injustices and crazy things happening in this world, but God hears those cries, and he takes note of those cries, and he's going to do something about it. And at the end time, we know for sure judgment is going to be upon those who have mistreated others, and God hears the cries when we cry out. And he takes note, which I was like, oh, yes.
Yeah. It's nice to know. And it's funny, because when he says the word fat in there, I was talking to someone about this, and I was like, that's interesting that I've never heard the word fatten used like that before. But then you think about it, and, like, usually, like, when it comes to, like, pigs or something, it's like the way that they fatten them is they feed them junk. It's to, like, fatten it. And it's like, you're not feeding, like, pigs, like, apples and carrots to get them fat. You feed them junk. So I was like, in this scenario, the way that I guess an angle that you could perceive it at is, like, when he says you have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter, it's like we're filling ourselves with, like, the junk of, like, the world, basically. And, like, what all this wealth that we have, we're buying junk, basically, for it. And you're basically, like, fattening yourself up for, like, the day
I was
of
going
the
to say,
slaughter.
and James is very clear with that, where that leads.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like you're basically on, like, a downhill slope at this point, But I think a great points to point out is that this isn't the end. It's like the reason why we're reading these words today is because the judgment hasn't happened, and that there still is a chance to maybe reconsider where we're putting our money in our lives, and, like, where is our wealth lying. And it's like clothes and riches come and go, but, like he says, the clothes that you wear are moth eaten. It's like, and God wants to cover us with this robe of righteousness. It's like, how awesome would that be to be able to have a robe that doesn't erode at the end of the day, instead of having, like, riches that will, like, and they're like, what does it say? It's even like, and their corrosion will witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. It's like these like the riches of this world, the luster that they bring, are going to pass away at the end of the day. And it's like, we all know that, but sometimes we like to ignore that fact. So when you, like, continually remind yourself that, it's like, where are your priorities lying at the end of the day when it comes to your riches?
And this may sound weird, but that's why I think it's with all this crazy things, political turmoil right now, and, like, the coronavirus and all this stuff, I think that it is a valuable thing, because it reminds us that this world is not our home. And it's really easy to get really comfortable in the way that you're living. Like, me personally, like, of course, like, you're like, oh yeah, this is totally my life, but we forget that this isn't where we were meant to be. And this isn't our home. And that's why when things happen, like, what's been going on in our world right now, I think it's good as Christians to take it and be like, make it, our mind focus on God, to remind us, like, this isn't where we're supposed to be. This isn't our true home. And it just, how we handle it, if we, like, use it to make our minds go back on God, I think that it's really important. Because it's easy to get, like, fattened up, like this verse is saying.
And, like, you even go back to, like, the thing that it says about, like, what you do to the poor, you've, like, also done it to me. And it's, like, when you clothe them, everything. And it's, like, this scenario, I see, like, the same thing. It's, like, when you rob people... What was the thing I said? Oh, yeah. When we rob from the poor, you, like, robbing from Christ. It's, like, the same thing. It's, like, keeping that same mindset. And it takes me back to that parable that Jesus said. I read it yesterday for the first time. I've never heard it in my life. It's called about the rich man and Lazarus. Not Lazarus from the dead, but, like, the beggar. And, like, basically on how, like, Lazarus, if you guys don't know the parable, in a nutshell, Lazarus is a beggar, and he comes to this rich man's house. And it says that the rich man feasts a lot, is one of the things it says. And he also says that he's, like, purple linen. He's very rich, basically. But Lazarus is a beggar. He comes up to his door. He begs, and the rich man basically pushes him away. And then Lazarus ends up dying, and then the rich man ends up dying. And then it shows him in, like, this scenario. It was, like, weird how Jesus worded it, but, like, the rich man is, like, in Hades is what they say, and, like, the beggar and Lazarus is with Abraham or something. And there's this scenario where they're kind of, like, talking to each other, like, kind of from heaven to hell. It's a really weird parable. And basically what he's saying is the rich man is sitting there and he's like, why am I not in heaven? And Abraham is like, is because you didn't help Lazarus when he needed him, And then the rich man is, like, panicking, and he's like, well, can you at least, like, show I have a family. He's like, can you show my family, like, what it looks like what this afterlife looks like, like, send one of the dead alive again so that they can see, so they don't have to do the same thing I did. And Abraham is like, no, it's too late at that point. And a lot of people like to take that parable and they like to say, oh, this parable is all about the afterlife, but it's actually about this life right now. And, like, the whole point of the decisions we make now are going to it's going to affect our final destination, And they talk about this chasm in the parable. Chasm. And it's like they talk about it, and I think that's trying to show that, like, once you die, your fate is decided. It's like you're either gonna die or you're gonna live forever. And it's like you see, like, the rich man's pleading. He's like, oh my word, I don't want my family to go down the same path as I. Just bring me back to life. Like, show them that the dead, like, or something. And he's like, no, like, their decisions that they make now. Oh, he goes, let them study Moses and the prophets. And he's like, I don't need to show them I don't need to bring the dead alive. He's like, the Moses and the prophets tell them what they need to do. And it's like, this is the Moses and the prophets, the laws that he gives us. And it's like, if we follow these now, we can expect to be just like Lazarus,
I really like that.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I think it goes exactly with this scenario of just, like, where we're putting our wealth at the end of the day.
You don't hear that parable brought up very often, but it's really important, though.
Yeah,
like the lesson that it brings
out.
out.
And it's like I was surprised that, like, Jesus, like, was saying it, because I was like, well, this is not like one of his usual
it's like
farmer. This is like Hades, heaven kind of parable, and you're like,
wow,
whoa, I know. So, anywho, it's a great story. It's definitely a story of, like, redemption and just, like, how it can play into our lives.
Well, and I think part of the reason why you see that the things that they did in this life affected their eternal destinations.
Right.
Is because I think the way that you do treat God's people is a reflection of your relationship, is a reflection of your relationship with God. Mm-hmm. Because if you love God, you'll value what he values. And we see throughout the Bible that God values people. He values his children. He sent Jesus down to die for his people. Right. So if you love him, that will be reflected through your life and through your actions.
Right.
Yeah, I heard someone. I heard someone say once that the way that you live and the way that you treat others is the way that you see God. Mm-hmm. And
what's working in should be shining throughout.
Yeah. And we talked about that earlier.
Yeah, we did, and James talks about it. Yeah. And what James is also going to talk about is in this next section. We have verses 7 through 12, and we're going to see the same idea of what he talked about way back in chapter 1 about this patient endurance. Do you remember, like, we talked about that way in chapter 1? Ooh. But he brings it up back again in chapter 5.
Oh, real quick, in verse 6. Oh. It says, the one that you have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you. I was a little, like, kind of confused.
Me too. When
on this verse, and I was like, I don't know. Like, I was thinking, when in verse 6, when it says you condemned and you have murdered the just, I was thinking, I mean, it's probably not just talking about actually literally murdering someone, but like murdering someone in your heart, you know, like even if you're like mean to them
Right.
or something. Like what did you guys think of that verse?
Oh, just like I think it was going back to the point that Anella was saying that like even there's so many injustices that happen. Like you notice he's not resisting him, he's not fighting back, and I feel like there's a lot of scenarios where you see someone like you see a lot of injustices happening, you know, and it's like even though he's not fighting back, it's because like in the end his justice will be served, you know, and I think that's like it's actually like. And it's like it takes back to the example that he says in verse 5 about like these poor people. They're like they can't do anything about it, even though the rich is taking money from them. But their justice will be served.
Oh, and that's
know?
why it says he does not resist you.
He doesn't resist, you know. But like their justice will be served at the end of the day. Like the Lord says, "Vengeance is mine." You know, it's not our place to take it, but it will be.
I just wanted to add one quick little thing.
Yeah.
While I was reading the first part of chapter 5, it kind of reminded me of a parable that Jesus said as well, and it's found in Luke 12 and verses 13 through 21. And it talks about the rich man who stores up for himself all this grain, and he has extra, and so he decides to build barns. And God says, "You fool, you don't know that you die tonight."
Right.
And for me, that was just really interesting because it seems like James is simply unpacking the lessons that Jesus is talking about there.
Same exact scenario.
And what was interesting is that in verse 22, right after, we see, "And Jesus said to his disciples, 'Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life.'" And then it talks about us not worrying. And I think that really hits at the root of this problem of why we choose to hoard and why we choose to keep for ourselves as opposed to giving to others is because it's a lack of faith. It's because we don't trust that God will take, in a sense, I think it has to do with us not trusting that God will take care of us and not trusting that God has a plan for our lives, but us instead taking that plan into our own hands and living our own lives.
Or just living out of fear, you know.
Right.
And I think that really ties in really well to what James says afterwards.
Verse 7 and 8?
Yeah, verse 7 and 8.
So in 7 and 8, so we actually kind of changed scenarios of what our, like, lesson that he's trying to teach now. He kind of throws in another one, and he talks about the patient endurance like he does in chapter 1, and actually, like, the importance of it and, like, how it plays into our lives. So, Andres, can you read verses 7 through 9?
Yeah. It says, "Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the earthly and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you condemn. Behold, the judge is standing at the door."
So it's not just because in chapter 1 you have to see the two scenarios that he talks about, and in chapter 1 he's talking about having a patient endurance when it comes to just trials in our lives, you know. But now he's talking about there's even more to that patient endurance, and that is that there's a coming judgment. And it's like the whole reason why you're enduring something is because you see the end goal and you know what the end goal is going to be. And like that's the whole reason why we're having this patient endurance. It's not because we're just trying to get through trials, but we know that there's a judgment even coming. And he uses the scenario of having a patient endurance like a farmer in verses 7 and 8. Yeah. And he talks about this rain, and it's actually it's a cool scenario that he talks about, but you see how he says that there is actually two rains that happen. And I think it's not just talking about physical rain, you know, but it's talking about like the
latter rain
with the Holy Spirit, I guess. And we've already seen the first rain when it happened back with the
disciples.
With the disciples, yeah, and we're about to see a latter rain that will happen, you know. But the part that I thought was so beautiful is the part where he says, "See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth." And I was saying he could have just said, "See how the farmer waits for the fruit of the earth." That's an easy sentence, but he throws in the word precious there. And it's like if God is this farmer like waiting for his harvest, you know, he's waiting for the fruit, and he's waiting for this latter rain because both rains have to happen. And that's actually how it actually works in real life. There's like a rain that happens in like November, and then there's one that happens in April. There's always two. But it's like if God is this farmer and like God's actually like patiently enduring, you know, he's waiting, but he's waiting for, and he calls us precious there. And I think that just shows like how special we are and how much he values us, you know. It's such a and it's like you see the word precious when it talks about like the precious blood of the lamb, you know. And it's like this word is just used to like signify just like the importance of like how valuable it is, you know. And like so when he calls us like his precious fruit of the earth, I love that, because it shows that I'm not just fruit that he's trying to grow, but I'm so much more than that, you know. And I love that part. And I don't know, what are you guys' thoughts so far in 7 through 9?
Well, for me, as I was saying before, I think that the beginning part has some sort of lesson about us not worrying and trusting in God.
Right.
And I think the patience is also a sign of that trust. Because if you don't believe that someone is coming, you're not going to wait for them, right? So it's about us trusting that God is going to come back and that he will fulfill his promises. And I think it's the same with the lesson of the farmer. When the farmer knows that what he has sown, he will reap. And so he waits, and so he nurtures that seed and that plant.
Right.
Because he knows that it will come. He doesn't just he doesn't think that it won't happen. He knows that it will.
He knows, but he's just like enduring it, you know.
And I think what I thought of as in this verse is like he's saying specifically, therefore be patient until the coming of the Lord. And I was talking to one of my friends the other day, and we're talking about a lot of times it's very easy to like be scared of the end times and like how bad it's going to be, and we're going to be persecuted and for standing up for our faith. But we were talking and we're like, yeah, but that's not what we should be focused on. We should be focused on when Jesus comes, because it's going to be just a moment of, in the big scheme of things, a moment of suffering compared to the coming of Jesus. It's going to be like, oh wow,
And like living eternity.
yeah, like
you know?
that was worth it.
Yeah.
That was 100% worth it.
Right.
I think it's important. He's saying, therefore be patient and just look toward your goal and look toward the coming of Jesus, because that's how you're going to get through the end times, and that's how you're going to get through these hard times. But you need to be patient. You can't just expect like, I'm tired now, like come, but Jesus has the perfect timing.
Right. And he doesn't even just say be patient and endure, but he also says in verse 8, establish your hearts for the coming of the Lord. And like that word establish, I heard like it can also be used to say strengthen, I think, or something.
I looked that up actually,
Yeah.
and it means to set fast, but it also means to literally turn resolutely in a certain direction. And I thought that was really interesting. And then heart means your thoughts and your feelings. And for me, what that kind of meant is that not only does your heart need to stand firm in your belief, but as a Christian, you also need to turn away from the things that are opposite from the goal that you're looking towards.
Right. And it's like when we establish, it's like it's important that while we're patiently enduring, we're establishing our hearts like right now. And like, and we see countless examples of like how you establish your heart. You know, like God says that He'll guard our hearts against the devil when we allow him into our lives. You know, and that's like one way that we can like establish our hearts. And it's funny because since we're talking about harvest and everything, when it comes to like wheat and tares, you know, you don't know if it's a wheat or a tare until the harvest day. And then once on that harvest day happens, you can discern the difference between the two. And it's like the same thing here. It's like, it's like we are trying to establish our hearts right now so that when the harvest day comes, it's like we're not plants, so it's like we're not set to be tares, we're not set to be wheat. We have the choice if we're going to be a wheat or a tare in the end of the day. But it's once it happens, you're either a wheat or you're either a tare. You can't go back.
Can't revert.
There's no redo button. That's why he's telling you, establish your hearts now for the coming of the Lord. And it's funny because I think it's kind of actually better that they never mention when Jesus is coming, because like I feel like if you like look back then about like Jesus's disciples, if Jesus had said that I'm going to be coming in 2,000 years and counting, you know, it's like if he said that to them, it like the message wouldn't seem to be as strong, because they're like, it's not near,
As urgent.
It's not as urgent, right? So it's not as near, so we really don't need to talk about it. But
Yeah.
because he just constantly says that it's near, people are always like, well, he keeps saying it's near, but it seems like
Yeah.
he's never coming, you know. But I think by us not knowing it's near, we continue to keep our hearts established, you know.
I think it's important. I think when he says it's near, it is near for every single person, because no one lives 2,000 years. Every person
Right.
lives at least maybe 80, 90 years. And so the truth is, if you have your lifetime of 90 years to get your heart established to God, even if there's 2,000 years left, like 2,000 years ago, there was like Paul or something, he still converted to God at that time during his lifetime.
Right.
He can't be saved now. He's dead.
Right.
We only have 90 years to live, or 80 or 70. You could die early, 30 years
100.
old. Or 100.
Someone going-
You know, and so for us, if God doesn't come for another 1,000 years, I'm not sure, I don't think so, but if he doesn't, we still have our lifetime to get close to God.
Right.
We don't have extra time. So for every single person, the truth is, yeah, it's near for each person, even if you lived 3,000 years ago, because they had a lifetime to live.
Just trials never promised.
Exactly.
And yeah, we never know when we are going to die. We have no idea. And I think it's important that he says, establish your hearts now, because I think we forget. I mean, it's easy to get caught up, but what we do on this earth matters. Like how we act, who we serve, it matters, whether we realize it or not. But what we do now is literally what we do now is going to determine the rest of eternity for us. And I don't know. I always have to remind myself that, because it's really easy to be like, I know Jesus is coming. Or if you do something, you're like, it'll be okay. Jesus will forgive me. And that is like, oh my goodness. I remember when I was little, I told my dad, I was like, Dad, guess what? Like, I have this wonderful plan. And he's like, what? I'm like, so when I'm doing something bad, I'm like, it's okay. Jesus will forgive me. And my dad was like, you can't do that. He was like
breaking the system.
Yeah, he's like no.
It's like Revelation.
Yeah. He was like,
But the Bible.
yeah, but he had like a conversation. He's like, like that in itself, like, that's like to treat God like that, like, he was saying like that in itself is like a sin to do if you're like, Jesus will forgive me, like, but we have to be serious and fervent about what we're doing, and when we do mess up, that we don't go back, and we fervently ask for forgiveness, because it matters.
And James actually talks about this earlier. I remember we studied about our plans, and how that would affect our life. And I think you guys like really hit on something, is that, and this sounds kind of morbid, but it's true, that we should live every single day as if it's our last. And I heard someone say to me once, like, if you were to go right now, would you be doing what you want your life to be known for? So when you hear death, do you think, are my actions more important than they ever have been before? Or do you think, man, I need to change my life because death is coming?
Right.
And I think that's the problem, is that sometimes we forget. Death is imminent. Our lives aren't promised, but our eternal lives are. So we should be living for that.
Right. Living for beyond death. And in verse 9, when he says, do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Times of hardship can cause us to be less than loving with our Christian brothers and sisters, And it's like, how many times do I hold a grudge to other people in my life? Or have I held it, not even against other people, but against, like, the church, And just, like, it's never enough, And it's like, we hold grudges left and right. But I think that end part where he says, behold, the judge is standing at the door, and he's standing at what door? And he's like, I think it's standing at the door of our heart, And it's like, I don't think this verse is for you to throw at someone else and say, look at, like,
don't
the
judge
judge
me.
is standing, don't judge me. The Lord is, like, standing at the door of your heart, because he's saying, behold, the judge is standing at the door. And I think this is for a personal thing. Like, it's not our job to, like, beat other people with the Bible,
Yeah.
It's for us to say, they're like, no, the Lord is a judge, and he'll do justly whatever he's going to do, but he's standing at the door of my heart, And it's like, if I can't show love toward I think it's like what you said earlier. It's like, what's in our hearts is like reflecting how we feel about God, And it's like how you feel about the creation of the Creator, And so I think it's a good point to make. And I think when it comes to patient endurance, just looking at time, we see the rest of this verses, I'll read them, 10 through 12. He talks about examples of people that patiently endured, and how we can show how there's an exhortation in light of the coming judgment before Jesus. And I'll read 10 through 12. It says, my brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job, and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear, neither by heaven nor by earth, or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes, and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. And the beginning of that, verse 10 and 11, we see that so many old prophets in the Old Testament, like Jeremiah is like the best example that I can think of. The guy was like thrown into a dungeon, and his ministry still like surpassed so much, And it's like we see these old prophets, they practice patient endurance. It's not just us now. It's not something that we have to do today. It's been going on since the beginning of time, And then he gives the example of Job, and then you ask yourself, like, what do these old prophets and Job like have in common? And I think it's because they all endured the trials that came into their life. And they endured. How did they endure? By looking at the end goal. Actually, Job is maybe even different scenario, because he probably didn't even know what the end goal was. Maybe like Job's scenario, it's like the way he endured was by knowing. I think he knew that there was going to be something greater at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know if I could, when it talked about the prophets, or this story came to mind in the Dark Ages, there's lots of stories about how they were persecuted, all the people who stood up for truth, and there's one specific man named Jerome, and he was thrown in prison, and he was in there for almost a year, and they had him like in the shackles where, you know, his feet and his hands were tied in these wooden things. And finally he was like, he couldn't handle it anymore, and he's like, I'm going to recant my faith. And so he went, you know, to the people and the Pope, whatever, and signed this thing saying he was going to recant his faith. And he did, but then he came back because he just felt so bad, and he felt absolutely terrible because he had recanted his faith for everything that he stood for. And he came back and he's like, throw me back in prison, persecute me, whatever, but I regret what I did. And I don't know, this, every time I hear this story, it's like, oh my goodness, like this guy is crazy, because when he was put in the stake, he put the same hand that he had signed the petition with, and he threw his hand in the fire and let his hand burn first, because he said, he's like, he just felt so bad. And he's like, Lord, forgive me. And he threw his hand in the fire while he was still alive, and he let his hand burn off first so he could see it. So, because that was the hand that signed the petition that he was going to recant his faith.
Dang.
I know, it's crazy. And then we think now, and we're like, oh my goodness, would I do that, you know? And it's talking about, look to the prophets, but it's also, I think, really encouraging that they did endure the things before. And just
Right.
looking, you know, at their example, and at the hard times, we can, you know, if we're looking to God,
Right.
we can do it too.
I think when we know that God, when we look at the trials that God puts in our life, that we know that, how did I word it? When we understand that God has a good purpose, even painful things are put into good perspective. And then a good scenario that I saw of that is if someone's coming at you with a knife, you're going to obviously try and fight and resist them as much as possible. And then if they succeed to stab you, you're going to feel like you've completely failed at life. But if a surgeon is coming at you with a knife, you're going to accept the surgeon and the knife. And you're going to hope that they even make a bigger cut than the guy coming at you, because you know that there's good intentions at the end. And it's like, that's sometimes how we perceive God. We sometimes feel like God is charging at us with a knife, like because James tells us that God allows trials in our lives, you know, trials and temptations in our lives, and so we think that God is charging at us with this knife and that he's trying to do damage on us. But I think we forget that sometimes that he's the master physician, you know, and it's like these trials and temptations he puts in our lives is because he's trying to make us stronger than we were before, you know. And I think that's how these prophets and how Job, you know, got through these trials, because they knew that the things that God was putting them through, especially Paul was a really good example of that the trials that he went through were making him a stronger person. And Paul mentions that so many times. And in James too, James is another one who says the trials we go through are making us stronger than we were before.
Yeah.
And I guess to end, I guess we could talk about verse 12 real quick.
Yeah. Oh,
It
yes.
kind of threw me off, this verse real quick, while we ended it, because the message that he's saying, I think, is just, if you're gonna say truth, be confident and follow through with what you're saying. You know, like, let your yes be yes and let your no be no. And I think, but he says, but above all, my brethren. And it's like, above everything he's saying, this is what's important. And you wonder, because I read this thing, and so many commentators have like just wondered, like, why James says above everything he's saying that this is so important. And I think it's showing just how important truth is to God, and how it's, when he says do not swear, I think a lot of times you know, when someone says, I could have sworn that she said she hated me or something like that, you're not very confident in your truth. You don't know that she exactly said that. You're just kind of, and I think it puts less of a weight of what your truth actually is. And I think when God says, when someone comes and asks you about truth in the Bible, like someone asks you, does God love me? Or, you know, can I have peace during these times of trials? He wants your yes to be a yes. He doesn't want us to be yes, well, you know, he wants to make sure that we're so strong in truth. And I think that's how important truth is to God, you know, and he wants to be confident in it. And then, like, and it's something that I still like wonder, because he says, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath. And even Jesus says, he takes these exact words, and Jesus says, don't even swear by the hairs on your head. And it's like, I think James is saying we shouldn't be just swearing by anything in general, because, and the reason Jesus says when he says it is because the heaven is owned by God, earth is owned by God. None of it's owned by you. Not even the hairs on your head are owned by you. It's all owned by God. So it's like...
And yeah, I also think, like, Jesus is saying, he's like, you either are with me or you're not with me.
Yeah.
It's yes or no.
Right.
And he wants us to be confident in ourselves too, like, yes or no.
Right.
That there shouldn't be degrees of truth in your language.
Exactly.
That it's
It
not
should
like
just be a yes.
that yes is less than if you swear by something. You know.
Exactly.
I think James is saying that your yes and your no should have as much power and as much gravity as anything that you could ever do.
Right.
So that the truth
Yeah.
of the God that you serve reflects through you.
Right.
And truth is truth.
Exactly.
There's no.
Which
It's
can
just-
sometimes be controversial.
I know,
people
because
say my truth, your truth.
and people can like
But
be like, oh, well, that's good that's working for you, type of thing. But God's like, He's like, no, all of y'all are on the same playing field.
Yeah, people are like, I swear this is saying something else. Like, I know it. I've heard people
like-
say that before, and it's like, well, then you're not very confident in like what your truth
Yeah.
is saying. You know, I think I'm kind of sad because next week we're actually going to be wrapping up.
Yeah,
what
it's
James has to
crazy,
say
bro.
at the
Wow.
end. But the lessons you see, he has repeated lessons, and I think one of the main themes that we see throughout James is like he's trying to hit deeper issues than these surface level. He gives surface level examples, but there's deeper issues at hand.
And I
he's
feel like
talking
this is
about.
something that is very applicable for every Christian.
Right.
To, like, I don't know. Like, so far it's been like, ooh, James really is hitting some.
I know.
Right, some nails on the head. Well, to wrap this up, we just wanted to mention about some people. We wanted to shout out, I guess, some people that are watching today. We have Campbell River, Canada.
Canada.
British Columbia. Wisconsin. We have someone from Texas, Long Island,
Oh my
and
goodness,
we
that's
had
what that
Peru.
means.
Yeah. Before Christ, Canada. We have some prayer requests.
Awesome.
Shay Mateo says, please pray for all the SDA youth.
Amen.
Justin
what's
Ross said,
up? Call
please
me
pray for
Scott.
the United States as well as for China with all the flooding. And then, hi, I'm Ed, said, please pray that my friends join us next week. So we've got many prayer requests.
China's flooding?
Anela, do you want to end our amazing Bible study with prayer?
Sure.
Okay.
Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I want to thank you so much for the opportunity that we have to be together today, Lord. And I just ask that the lessons that we've learned throughout the book of James and today as well, that they would become real in our lives and that we would apply them, Lord. I pray for all the prayer requests that were just mentioned and that you would be with each and every person listening back home and that your Holy Spirit would just be with each and every one of us and that we would become more and more like you. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 We just want to make sure you guys join us for a church service at 10 today. And we hope to see you guys next week when we finish off James. Bye. Happy Sabbath.
Bye.
I don't even turn it off.
Ethan, you were so good.
Oh,
I was just
really?